Almost 30 years after democracy, and the plight of South Africa's military veterans remains a sore point as many continue to live in abject poverty. Now, this despite having fought for the liberation of this country. Good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. I'm Sakina Kamwendo. Now, some have even died without having seen the fruits of the struggle as the state took its time to implement the Military Veterans Act, which of course provides for the social needs of veterans and their families. And now with the announcement that some veterans will receive pensions, it still remains to be seen as no implementation date has yet been announced and questions abound about what the criteria will be that the department will use to determine who actually qualifies and who doesn't. So tonight we are asking, what is the fate of South Africa's military veterans, and this almost 30 years into democracy? And joining me to discuss this and of course other issues around this matter is the Deputy Minister of the Department of Defence and Military Veterans, Mr. Thabang Makwetla. But first, let's watch this insert produced by Andrew Mokhatle.
The current shape and form of the country's army is a result of marathon negotiations and intense horse trading between the apartheid government and liberation political formations that preceded the installation of South Africa's democratic dispensation. On the eve of the 1994 democratic general election, the South African National Defence Force replaced the South African Defence Force, infamous for committing a number of apartheid-era crimes and atrocities. This followed the decision to integrate non-statutory forces of Umkhonto we Sizwe and Azanian People's Liberation Army with the South African Defence Force and the armed forces of the former homelands of Transkei, Bophuthatswana, Venda, and Ciskei.
It is unfortunate that when we demobilized the combatants and integrated you into civilian lives, you had to return to your communities where opportunities for employment with your skills set are severely limited. Many of you have been reduced to abject poverty.
The process of integration has not been plain sailing though, with some veterans from the liberation forces still feeling left out and living in squalor. 2 years ago, after listening to endless promises over the years, the situation turned ugly during a protest when a group of desperate veterans was accused of kidnapping the Minister and Deputy Minister of Defense, an allegation they denied, before they were hauled before the court to answer for charges of conspiracy to commit kidnapping and 26 counts of kidnapping. The case was subsequently withdrawn by the National Prosecuting Authority. In terms of the Military Veterans Act of 2011, the state is obliged to provide social services for military veterans, including housing, education, and pensions, among others. But the criteria of who qualifies as a military veteran remains contested. While the department says it is now ready to pay pensions to military veterans, it has not set a definite date. Earlier this year, some liberation struggle veterans demanded about 4 million as a once-off payment and a monthly pension payout of 15,000 for each veteran, a demand that has received objections. Reports say out of the 82,000 military veterans, only 9,000 qualify.
Considering the status of the department right now, that there's no one in charge. For years, the department is dysfunctional, and there is also an intervention from the office of the president. I think, maybe the deputy minister will be able now to say what has happened to other applications? Has the department responded to each person who applied and also been not accepted to be a deserving a military veteran? Because that's where now the problem is. They may say now 9 of the 8,000 they're talking about, but the question is, has the department responded to those people who say why they were not, accepted?
After almost 30 years of democracy, concerns remain about how the democratic government has handled the matter of struggle military veterans, as those left out keep hoping that someday they will be properly recognized for the role they played in fighting for a democratic South Africa. I am Andrew Mokhatle for Unfiltered, SABC News.
And of course, I'm joined here in studio to discuss these matters by the Deputy Minister of the Department of Defence and Military Veterans, Mr. Thabang Makwetla. Deputy Minister, thanks so much for coming through. Good to have you with us.
Thank you very much for having us on your program, Sakina.
So this is a very difficult discussion, I would imagine, because at the onset, on Freedom Day, when we are having this discussion, I would think that it would be a very difficult admission on your part, as someone who yourself was part of the struggle, to admit that this government has failed so many of those who have fought for the freedom that we today enjoy.
Yes and no, Sakina. What I should indicate right from the beginning is that the story of military veterans in South Africa is quite an involved story. And as it is the case with any truth, context is very important. And here, context is the historical context of where we're coming from with this challenge in government of looking after our military veterans properly. Let me just say, it is today a pleasant coincidence that we are in the studio when we actually on this day are commencing the rollout of the military veterans pension as part of the benefits that are legislated to be made available to military veterans. We had yesterday a press briefing where we were actually launching the commencement of the rollout. I want to take one step back and say that in 1994, when the integration process happened, there was no anticipation at the time that we will have the problem at the scale at which it is confronting us now. And the reason is because the integrating military veterans from the different organizations, military organizations at the time, were allowed to take voluntary severance packages. And of those who took the severance packages, it was not anticipated that we will have military veterans who don't have pensions at all, because they were coming from the non-statutory forces. And when they were in service with the non-statutory forces, they were not remunerated. They were not gainfully employed, so they had no pensions.
So just on a point of clarity,
yes.
With regard to those who did take the severance packages, who exactly are we talking about?
The severance packages were taken by military veterans, both from the statutory forces and also from the non-statutory forces. That is why it was said to be an employee-initiated severance decision. So what happened is that we then had military veterans who were living at that point, who did not qualify for the political special pension that those who were coming from exile and those who were in the country but for political reasons were not gainfully employed. we had among them those who did not qualify for the special pension because of their age cohort. The special pension only covered those who were above age 35. Everyone below age 35 did not qualify. But of course, in the subsequent years, an intervention was made. The law was amended to drop that threshold, but still there were military veterans who were without pensions. So the pension that is being introduced, that we are rolling out now, for the first time is doing away with military veterans who don't have pensions. There are military veterans who are receiving state pensions of one kind or the other, and the procedure as far as who qualifies for this particular pension is that if the state pension you are receiving, let's say you are a military veteran and all you were receiving was an old age pension, that pension will now be topped up with the difference between the military veterans pension that we are paying out now, which is 5,200, and what the old age pension is paying out, which is just 2,080. So I'm just giving an example. There would be other military veterans who are receiving state pensions, but that are below 5,200. The advice is that those who are receiving less than 5,200, they should forego the pensions that they are receiving and apply for the military veterans pension, the 5,200. Or otherwise, they can apply for the military veterans pension, and what would happen is that they will be given the balance, the difference of what the pension they are receiving now is and what we are paying out as far as the military veterans pension is concerned.
So I would imagine in terms of some of the disgruntlement would be those who are questioning the criteria, even today, 29 years after we moved to a democratic dispensation, about who actually is a military veteran. And I think when it comes to the statutory forces, that would perhaps be easier to define. But what about those who were not necessarily part of the discussions at the point where the integration happened? Have you subsequently had discussions about that and integrated them as well?
I actually wanted to explain that point about what happened when the integration happened in 1994. The expectation was that all members of the integrating forces would be allowed to come into the system. However, government, and that was a parliamentary decision, opted for an approach that had the effect of bringing down our force levels, that we must cut down the size of our defense force because the time of conflict had come to an end, and there was no justification why the country should still have a defense force of the size that we had before. At the time of the cessation of hostilities, the South African National Defense Force permanent force was about 122,000. And we, in the defense review, agreed that we will have a defense force of 75,000 permanent force members, between 75,000 and 72,000. And what it meant is that there was going to be a releasing of huge numbers of soldiers on both sides, both statutory and non-statutory, and therefore there was a need for programs to assist their resettlement into civilian life. And that is why at the time there was a program called the Peace Corps, where the Department of Defense, under the Department of Defense, a training program, a center was established in Pelendaba, just west of Pretoria, where the Ministry of Defense mobilized resources from Taiwan, from Germany, in order to provide the training of military veterans into all kinds of portable skills that they could rely on. It is only much later, when the 2009 administration in government came into office, that there was an appreciation that the demobilization process has not successfully ensured the resettling of military veterans back into community, into civilian life. And that is why in government you now had a new policy arising out of a ministerial task team that was put together by the Minister of Defense, then under instruction of the President, to say, find for us a framework policy-wise that we're going to use to support these military veterans, but also propose a machinery that we must have in government to support these military veterans. Arising out of that decision, we then had the Ministry of Defense proposing that we must have a full-fledged Department of Military Veterans, as we now have today. And in relation to the policy, just briefly, the framework of the policy was that the policy must not only provide portable skills for these military veterans, but it must also provide welfare support to these military veterans. Hence, we have today in policy, in our government, support for military veterans with respect to housing, health, education, and also jobs. So that was the recognition that beyond just providing these military veterans with skills, government needed to provide welfare support. That commenced the latest chapter now of government's experience in relation to supporting military veterans as to what actually happened, and I can explain more. That is the period now from 2011 to where we are.
Perfect, because that's when the proclamation happened in 2011. So we are now in 2023, and we'll talk about where that process is now. And of course, just how successful has it been in delivering on what was in that proclamation to the members of the military forces on either side who would have qualified for those benefits. But of course, we're going to take a quick break here on Unfiltered. When we come back, we continue the discussion with Deputy Minister of the Department of Defense and Military Veterans, Mr. Thabang Makwetla. Welcome back to Unfiltered, and we're discussing the plight of South Africa's military veterans with Deputy Minister in the Department of Defense and Military Veterans, Thabang Makwetla, and giving us an explanation of the integration in that first segment in terms of how we got to where we are and, of course, the proclamation. But let's take a look now at this graphic showing the military veterans' budget allocation. So let's just take a look at what has been allocated, and, of course, we'll find out how it's been spent. There you have it, the military veterans budget allocation, and you have there 666 million rand allocated for the 2022-2023 financial year. Previous year it was 607 million rand. 2020-21 financial year 481 million, and 652 million the year before that, and the 2018 financial year saw expenditure of 627 million rand. Deputy Minister, are those figures correct before we try to extrapolate any further information from them?
The figures seem to be what I'm familiar with. The budget of the Department of Military Veterans has been hovering over the last 10 years around 500 million, between 500 million and 600 million. It has always been in that region.
So in terms of the proclamation, and the military veterans, how much of that allocation has gone to them?
Let me just say that the problem of the Department of Military Veterans has been the size of the department, because part of that money is what goes into the compensation of employees. And because the department is unable to spend all of the money on salaries if, for instance, we were to have significant infrastructure in the provinces where military veterans need access, there wouldn't be much left to actually roll out the benefits themselves. So it's a department which from its incubate stages in 2011 up till now has functioned with a very constrained number of warm bodies to execute its mandate. However,
you would appreciate, Minister,
yes,
that if you're a military veteran and you are struggling and you're living in abject poverty, you know, having to get by on whatever meager earnings you can scrap together, you want to know exactly what happened with that 607 million rand and why are you even returning money if people actually are in need?
That question is very important because indeed, even with the limited budget the department has, there's been continuously money returned to Treasury at the end of the financial year because of underspending. There are challenges of the department which are really subjective. If I may give an example, a situation where you have people employed not with sufficient skills and capacity for what they must, for the roles that they must play.
But whose fault is that, Minister? Because, you know, when you return money to the fiscus, you are essentially saying that you actually don't need that much money. They have every right to view it as such. And yet, people are expecting a service delivery for the military veterans from that payout. And it's not good enough to say that you have employed people. Who employed those people who do not have the necessary skill set to deliver? Who employed them?
Indeed, it's us in the form of the decisions taken within the office of the accounting officer, which is the DG of the department, but also us as the ministry that is overseeing the functioning of the department through monitoring and advising the accounting officer, the DG. So we are responsible. And also the weaknesses of irregular conduct within the department, the absence of consequence management, which in many times has been flagged by the Public Service Commission in its reports. That problem is, of course, a leadership problem. So we can't run away from it. The point that I wanted to make is that that notwithstanding, even with those subjective problems overcome, there are objective problems, which is just the size of the department as a result of the budget that it has. It is for that reason that when the president intervened as a result of the growing grievances from the military veterans by establishing a presidential task team, one of the things that the presidential task team identified was the need for the department to be networked in its delivery responsibilities with provincial government, to utilize provincial machineries in the form of provincial governments where services military veterans must get can be delivered by provinces.
But that's not good enough, Mr. Makwetla, because when did that happen?
2020.
2020.
Yes.
And yet, all of the years preceding that, what was the department doing? How did the department not realize that there was a big problem here? The subjective problems, as per your own explanation, are self-inflicted. So why wasn't anything done? It's not good enough to a military veteran sitting there right now watching and listening to you, who's waiting for a house, who is waiting for a pension. It's not a good enough explanation.
Yes. No, that's absolutely correct. You're right. And that is why in government, generally, success can only happen. Delivery can only happen if we all are intolerant to failures. Where there are failures, corrective measures, consequences are effected.
But by your own admission, that is not happening. There is no consequence measures. You are not intolerant to failures because this has continued. So where does the solution lie, Mr. Makwetla? What is the problem for you per se, as the Deputy Minister who's in charge of this? Why are you, because ultimately you are failing. Regardless of what everyone else below you is doing, the buck will stop higher up with you, for example. You are failing. So why are you allowing people to fail and take you down with them?
You're correct, Sakina. In the ministry, as I speak, we have resolved that we will not accept any further losing of opportunities to get the lives of military veterans bettered. And it is part of the reason why, as we speak, the department is without a DG because of the decisions we have taken to advise that the DG must be put on precautionary suspension in order to make sure that we execute the necessary inquiries in what is evidently wrong with the department, in what is evidently a failure on the part of the department to put in place very strategic capacities in the department, among which, just for an example, if I may, share, every department has to have a legal branch. You've got to have legal people who are advising the department on every action and every activities that the department is involved in. The department must also have internal controls. There must be an internal audit committee that advises the accounting officer about anything that is not going right within the department. You must have adequate people who are responsible for the human resource branch of the department. Supply chain, all of these, they are very important. It's the back end of the department, but without the back end of the department is properly staffed and with the necessary skills, the sharp end delivery side of the department will always suffer. And this is what we are seeking to correct.
When did you first realize that, Deputy Minister?
From the reports we have been receiving, we were able to see that we are not moving. In 2020...
We could have told you that for free.
No.
The military veterans have been telling you that in so many ways. You yourself were part of a group of leaders who were held hostage by military veterans, making those very points. So why did you need a piece of paper to confirm that to you?
Well, let me just explain that the challenges of the Department of Military Veterans, they are a function of leadership, as I have said. In this administration, from 2019, just before this, the COVID pandemic, we were very clear about what our priorities were. And it was for that reason that we did not hesitate when the DG, who is now suspended, approached us to say there are suspensions that she has effected as a result of wrongdoing, irregular, poor management that has happened, for which steps were not taken to correct. And we supported her. And that is why now it is almost more than a year, not almost more, it's more than a year that we have had senior managers within the department who were suspended by the DG on the basis, in the way we received the reports, on the basis that they were involved in irregular managerial practices that were weakening the department, and therefore there had to be consequences. We did not hesitate to support.
So when were they suspended? When were they suspended?
They were suspended in August 2021.
And they are still on suspension?
They have just been brought back on suspension now. Unfortunately, because the processes to give them the opportunity to put their side of the story, those processes were not professionally executed. And as a result...
That's a dereliction of duty, Deputy Minister.
And that is for that reason that the DG has been put on suspension. And that's why I'm saying that we are very resolute about correcting the department. We're not even intimidated by the situation. We know what is the right thing to do. And all I can say, with time, give us time, the results will begin to show.
The military veterans don't have time. But let me just end this segment with the question that I asked you at the very onset, if we could put that graphic back up. Because I asked you, like in the previous financial year, if we just can get the graphic up with the expenditure. And I started by asking you to confirm whether those numbers were in fact correct. And I wanted to know how much of the budget actually is spent on the military veterans themselves by way of delivering services to them from the department's budget. So if we can just put that up. So let's go to last year. 2021, 2022, 607 million rand. How much of that actually found its way to the military veterans themselves?
Of that money, just below 300 million would have gone to benefits of military veterans. And the balance would have gone to salaries. But
salaries of people who don't know what they're doing. Salaries of people who don't have necessary skill set. Salaries of people who are returning money to the fiscus, Deputy Minister.
But that is exactly the reason why the ministry has taken the decision that it has taken. Absolutely.
But what about 2018-19? Didn't you realize the problem then?
2018-2019, the problem was there.
Exactly.
Yes.
2019-20, the problem persisted. It was there in 2020-21. And last year, now we're taking action.
Well, I cannot explain what would have been the impediments, why the previous administration, prior to the 2019 administration, was unable to assist the department the way. But what I can say is that from 2019, the administration has been, in this administration, the department has actually been very aggressively pushed to deliver. And the then acting Director General was actually very helpful in getting us to put the department in a healthy position, in driving, among other things, the process of amending the legislation, because part of the constraints that we have are structural constraints because of the policy not being fit for purpose. That process was commenced with by the acting DG, who was the General Mkwebi. But not only that, the filling of vacant posts with the acting DG at the time. After 2019, there was a lot of work done in filling vacant posts. Of course, in 2021, we started again a slowdown of that process of strategically strengthening the department. And we have taken a decision, a very, it's not an easy thing to put a whole Director General on suspension, on precautionary suspension. It was a very radical decision that we took, but we thought that it was justified and we'll be able to get things right.
If he's not doing his job, he should be suspended and action taken against him. But of course, we're going to continue with the discussion. We're talking to Deputy Minister Thabang Makwetla, and of course, the failure to implement the Military Veterans Act of 2011 effectively. This is the discussion we are having this evening. And of course, do feel free to let us know your thoughts here on Unfiltered, and we'll share some of those with the Minister and of course with the rest of you viewing. So let's take a quick break. And welcome back to Unfiltered. Now, the controversy about the database ensues. We're talking about military veterans, of course, on this Freedom Day edition of Unfiltered. Who qualifies, who doesn't qualify to be a military veteran, among others. I think the Deputy Minister went some ways in explaining some of that. But, of course, the criteria as well, some of the discussion points, but also talking to the processes and, of course, what's happening in the department at a broader level. So, Deputy Minister, with regard to the suspension of the DG, what sort of impact has that had on the delivery of services to those who are already on the database?
The suspension of the DG on the performance of the department would be, as it would be expected anywhere where there is no accounting officer. The department is functioning, obviously, with the very same managerial capacity that it has, that it had. The only difference is that the DG is on precautionary suspension. But all the processes that are expected to happen on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, all those processes, the people who are responsible for them are there.
So there's been no disruption in services. So because some people have complained that they have seen, tailing down in some instances of the effectiveness of the service delivery to those who have been receiving services. So are you aware of that?
No, there would be no such a syndrome. Because the DG is not the person who's executing. The DG is only at the pinnacle, at the head of an organization that is a system. That system continues to function even when there is no one, even when the DG is on suspension. So it would not be, factually accurate to say there would be a decline in the performance of the department because the DG is not there.
So people are saying that they have not received, at least some of the ones that we've received messages from, which ultimately lead us to have these sort of discussions, saying that they haven't received their pensions. Are you aware of some people who, for one or other reason, have not received their pension payouts? No,
let's clarify the issue about the pension. There's no pension that has been paid by the Department of Military Veterans. The military veterans pension that they are now entitled to commences today. That's why we had a press conference yesterday to announce a military veterans pension which was legislated in 2011, but which government never provided the funding of within the Department of Military Veterans budget. We are only commencing that today on South Africa's Freedom Day to roll out the pension to military veterans. All pensions in government are paid by social development and treasury. There are no pensions that the department is responsible. This pension for military veterans that we are rolling out from today, we have resolved to employ the capacity of the Government Pension Administration Agency, GIPA, to pay out this pension for us. And over the last 2.5 months, they've been in 6s and 7s. And I must take this opportunity to commend the spirit with which they approach the project. Most of the time, we complain about lack of batupili. I think in this instance, GIPA officials and the CEO deserve our appreciation, because we are now able to pay this pension today because of the GIPA machinery. They have put everything in place. They have gotten their own employees trained in all 9 provinces for purposes of processing applications for this.
So perhaps some of the military veterans overeager because, as you say, it starts paying out today. But what does that mean? Who will be paid out? And what is the exact date? Is it today, the 27th of April?
Today, the 27th of April, applications for the military veterans pension are being processed from today by JIPA.
So applications are being processed starting today?
Today, yes.
So when are you looking to start paying out?
As soon as the first application has been processed and there's a decision on it, we pay out. I can't say when will that happen. The turnaround time of the processing, it's an administrative, it's an operational matter. I will not be able to speak to that point.
But it would be prudent to have timeframes in place that say, you know, we need to figure this out in such and such a time, so that you actually do have a date whereby you say we will start paying out from the 1st of June or whatever the case may be. Wouldn't that be prudent?
We start paying out today.
But you're processing applications starting today.
What I'm saying that if the processing of an application would take a day, we would start paying today. My point is that in the regulations, we provide information about the time lines for each step in the value chain. That when you have applied for this pension, within 90 days, you must receive a reply from JIPA that says you have successfully applied for this pension, and this is the date on which you must look forward to for the pension to be paid out. And if your application has not been successful within 90 days, there must be correspondence from JIPA that tells you the reason why your application is not successful, and indicating to you the recourse that you can take up in order to have your case reviewed. All of that is provided in the legislation in terms of the timelines within which the whole value chain is going to be.
So given that you say the application processes will start today,
yes,
will people be back paid? Let's say if their application is only processed and finalized in July, will they be back paid to today?
That is an administrative decision, which our understanding is that the policy, the policy decision we have taken that we will start paying from now, it means whatever time, depending on when your application was received, it will determine when your payment is going to happen. So even as your application may be at the top of the batch that we have received today, and the processing takes place a month later than the one that was processed on day one from that batch, the dating of the first payment will take that into consideration.
Okay. And then with regard to people's education funds for their dependents being paid out, are you aware of any backlogs there?
There are backlogs in relation to housing, there are backlogs in relation to education. There are challenges in relation to providing health services with ease to these military veterans. And it is for that reason that the Presidential Task Team decided that with respect to these social services, education, housing, and health, because they are also provincial core competences with national departments, we must actually have the Department of Military Veterans having service-level agreements with the provincial departments in order to make it easy for for military veterans to access these services. This is what we are still busy working on with the provinces. We are engaging with the provinces to find the best modalities of delivering these social services to military veterans.
And what would be the value of those services to each military veteran?
In money terms?
Yes.
To each one of them?
Yes.
That information from the top of my head, I would not be able to provide. But it is quite substantial. It is quite substantial because the quantums of bursaries for students at foundation level, students at tertiary level, the quantums for funeral support, for the putting of tombstones, it's quite a lot of money. So the policy does provide a substantial basket of support financially to military veterans.
And the reason I'm asking that is because you would be well aware that the veterans were asking for a payment of, I think, around 4 million rand each as reparation. So, which is why I'm trying to figure out how much that basket actually is worth compared to what they were asking for.
Well, that's a different matter, the 4.2 million that you're talking about. And it is, just to clarify, it's not all military veterans who demanded to be paid that amount of money. There is a group of military veterans who staged a sit-in at the union buildings, which is now known as the Liberation War Veterans. Liberation Struggle War Veterans. It is that group. It's not all military veterans. And military veterans have associations that are officially recognized by the ministry and the department. There has been no such demand from those officially recognized military veterans organization and leadership. We also have an umbrella body which represents all the associations, both from the statutory forces and from the non-statutory forces, SANVA. SANVA has never tabled with the department a demand, or with the ministry a demand for 4.2 million. The rationale why those who were the group, and in context, we are not talking about the majority of military veterans. That's what we must underline. But the rationale behind their plea was that there is money. They believe, or rather they know, their organizations, prior to the integration in 1994, received from the United Nations for payment to all freedom fighters who were involved in the struggle in South Africa. And of course, that information is unfortunately very, incorrect. There is no such a thing. And in our engagement, we have explained that there is no, besides the point that it cannot then be held to, against this government that took responsibility for these military veterans from 1994, the money that they allege their liberation movements got, it's money that was paid out to those liberation movements if that had happened before 1994. So it can't be the responsibility of the state to go and chase those liberation movements and say, the United Nations gave you money for citizens, some of which are now our responsibility in government. Where is that money? I'm not saying that that story is actually even a credible story. There's no country where the United Nations pays freedom fighters for involvement in an effort to bring a better life for their own people. That is always understood to be a voluntary decision that each one of us who get involved in such an endeavor understands that it's not for money purposes, it's not a pecuniary, adventure. And no one was ever promised of freedom fighters that come Freedom Day, we are going to pay you for the sacrifices that you are making.
So I want to come back to the criteria then. So to bottom line that, for military veterans who may be watching right now, those who have made demands, as you have pointed out, are not necessarily officially recognized by the department. You are saying there is no money for reparations. Nobody, no entity anywhere in the world has ever given any funds to this government for reparations for military veterans.
Sakina, let me say, not that I know of any money that the South African government received from the United Nations to pay freedom fighters. I know of no such a development. I've not come across it. And with the experience globally of the involvement of the United Nations in countries where there's been conflict, I know of the United Nations programs to assist those countries post-conflict to settle down, to settle military veterans. You have, for instance, the UN, the United Nations, Great Lakes Nations, Integration and Settlement of Military Veterans Program. You have the UN also involved in Angola to assist the settling of military veterans post the political, settlement between the UNITA and MPLA. And that largely involves assisting those governments to provide economic livelihoods to these military veterans, not the social policy.
So how much have you received in that regard? Did the South African government receive anything in that regard? Not a cent.
Not a cent.
Okay. Hopefully this is helpful to the military veterans watching.
Yes.
And, just before we get to some of the social media engagement, coming back to the reasons why people have not had their bursaries paid out. What is the reason for that again?
The reason is simply the inadequate management capacity the Department of Military Veterans has.
Unacceptable, Deputy Minister.
Yes, it's unacceptable. And this is what South Africa's public must put pressure on the leadership, political leadership of the country.
You are the leadership. You are the political leadership.
Yes. We do what we are allowed to do by the lawmakers. We have parliament, we have public representatives. It is South Africa's.
Are you not a part of that?
I am part, but we're not talking at an individual. I'm now talking about finding solutions to the problem. What I'm saying is South Africa's public, if it mobilizes to pressurize Parliament, our public representative, to say Parliament put pressure on the executive to release more money for military veterans because we want to see 1, 2, 3 things happening for military veterans, it will assist us.
But why does the public have to put pressure on you, Deputy Minister? Why should the public have to do anything in this regard, given that these are people whom you know? Some of them, I would imagine, may have been out in the trenches with you. Why should you then need to be pushed, propelled into action to do the right thing?
Sabkina, the context, don't lose context. How the resources of the South African state should be used as far as priorities are concerned. It's not a Thabang Makwetla's decision.
But Thabang Makwetla, the Deputy Minister, is not spending the money in the department properly anyway.
You are raising another matter. Let me just explain this. The spending priorities of this country is what politically resonates with South Africa's broad public. We have had, for the longest time now, spending of government on defense, on our military establishment coming down to almost nothing. From over 2.5% of the GDP in 1990, today we are spending on defense 0.7% of the GDP. Why? Because South Africa's public said our priority is schools, it is health, it is houses. That I'm talking South Africa's public sentiments post-1994. And it is those sentiments that drives the prioritization of government. So when we omit, not of course that people are not appreciative, but it happens.
But
it
unfortunately,
happens. Yes.
we're out of time. But I have to say, as I end this discussion, Deputy Minister, even the monies that you are supposed to spend and disperse are not being spent in the most optimal way. As I say, people still waiting for bursary disbursements to happen. The money is there in the department. Why is it not happening? You send money back to the fiscus. Why? And then, we can't be surprised when it is thought that perhaps you don't need that money.
We are fixing the machinery.
You've been fixing the machinery,
No,
Deputy Minister.
we have not been
We're going to leave it there. Deputy Minister of the Department of Defense and Military Veterans, Tabang Makwetla, insists they are fixing the machinery, but you can make up your mind. Thanks so much for being with us here on Unfiltered, and it was great standing in for Sizwe Mpofu Walsh. I'm Sakina Kabwendo. Take care.